Hey guys, this is week 2, this is week 7. It's the video 2, or my second video. And in this video, we're going to talk about this whole concept of normal and standard lens. And typically these two terms are interchangeable. People will say, oh, you should get a 50. It's a good normal lens for that camera. And even Ben Long talked about the using a normal lens, but he did make a comment about different lenses, or sorry, different cameras, different formats use a different focal length as their normal lens. So before we get into that, let's just sort of talk about this thing about normal, because what is normal? And, I think we're all familiar with the concept of angles. So if I say 90-degree angle, there's 90 degrees, 45 degrees, and 52 degrees, just a little bit more than 45. It's kind of considered normal. So what does that mean? It's kind of a gray area. Everybody probably has different levels of peripheral vision, but typically 52 degrees is kind of considered the normal angle of view for human vision. And so any lens that sort of mimics that is considered a normal lens. And it's also the angle of view that you would typically get from a standard, what they call a standard lens. So what do we mean by standard lens? A standard lens is one whose focal length is the diagonal of the sensor frame, or the film frame, if you want to think back in the film days. So lots of words there. Focal length is the same as the diagonal of the sensor. So probably a good idea to have a diagram. So basically, if you think about 35 millimeter film, the film or the frame size was 24 millimeters by 36 millimeters. That was the size of that format. And that's the same size as our full frame sensors today. There's still film cameras out there, but generally, when we talk about full frame, we're talking about full frame cameras that have a sensor close to that size. So we are going to do this, we're going to do math. This is a science and theory class, so a little bit of math isn't going to kill you. We don't do a lot of math in this program, but we'll do a little bit here. And we are going to try to figure out what is that diagonal going across on a 35 millimeter sensor. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to do use something called the Pythagorean theorem. And some of you are already starting to get a little bit of anxiety. Maybe your throat is tightening, your heart is starting to pound a little bit faster. Maybe your palms are getting sweaty, because now we're talking about math and Pythagorean theorem, and you see this formula and already you start to panic. But it's a very simple formula, and I've got some pretty good diagrams that I'm going to walk you through the steps, and you'll see it'll be pretty straightforward. But there's our full frame sensor, 24 by 36 millimeter. We need to figure that out, and if we can figure that out, we should have a dimension that's fairly close to what should be the normal lens for that camera. So if we put the letter A there, and B there, and C is that diagonal line, how do we figure out C squared? Well, there's A squared. What we're going to do is use this formula. So we're going to square A, we're going to square B, and so in other words, 24 squared, 36 squared. So I don't know about you, I can't do that in my head, but luckily you guys have Apple computers, and they all have handy dandy little calculators in them, and you can just go into your applications folder, and you'll see there's a calculator there. And when you do anything to do with beyond adding and subtracting, and you want to do something complicated or sophisticated, like squaring something or finding the square root of something, then we need to go into the scientific. So we have to go view and go to the scientific, so that we see these extra buttons. So scientific calculator will show us the other buttons. So there's what we have so far. We know that 24, if we go back to the formula, C squared equals A squared plus B squared. So 24 squared plus 36 squared equals C squared. So punch in the numbers in the calculator, and you're going to get those numbers. And if you don't want to use the calculator, you can just go 24, multiply by 24, and you'll get that. 36 times 36, and you'll get that. And you're going to end up with this number once you add those two up, and you're going to go, that number equals c squared. Well, that means we now have to figure out, if we want to get c by itself, which is that diagonal, that's our whole goal here, then we have to find the square root of 1,872. So let's go back to the calculator, and you punch in that number, 1876, and there's the square root button right there, and you just click on it, and voila, it'll give us the number 43, and that diagonal is 43 millimeters. So that is the diameter of that image circle. So the manufacturers have to, when they think about a lens, they have to make sure that image that gets projected, that circular image, is big enough to cover the entire sensor. So that circle has to have a diameter of 43 millimeters at least. So what is a standard lens? Well, the standard lens in this case, based on this formula, would be 43 millimeters. Now, I've been involved with photography for over 25 years, and I've never seen a 43 millimeter lens. However, I have seen a 45 millimeter lens. And when I was a student here in the program, we used to have Minolta cameras, and the normal lens, or the standard lens that came with that camera when you bought it, was a 45 millimeter lens. However, most cameras, the normal lens is something close to that, and it's a 50 millimeter lens. And in fact, I don't know if I have it here, but Leica was one of the first manufacturers to start using a 50 millimeter lens. Something to do with the fact that they could make it a little bit less, it was a bit less expensive to make a 50 compared to a 43. I don't know, but 50 millimeter became the standard lens for film cameras, 35 millimeter film cameras, and hence the normal lens for full frame sensor cameras. So why? Who cares? Why do we care about this formula? Why do we need to know it? Well, part of that is so that as you're working with different formats, and there might be times when you're going to work with a medium format like this phase camera, that we have a bunch of these in loans, and it has a completely different sized sensor. Let's see if I can get this thing off. Than what you have in your camera. So this sensor is much larger. It's larger than, that frame is larger than what you would see in a full frame camera. So that means that if we were to calculate the diagonal, it would not be 43 millimeter, it'd be something larger. So it would require a larger a larger focal length to be its normal lens. So, yeah, I was going to talk a little bit about phase cameras and why they're so great and what's so great about having a bigger sensor. But I want to stay on track and talk about calculating what's the normal lens for this camera. Well, this digital back has a frame that is 43 by 40. That's the size of that sensor. So if we were to go in and do the same math, a squared or c squared equals a squared plus b squared, figured out the diagonal, we would realize that it comes to around 67 or 70 millimeter lens. However, usually when people buy this camera and it comes with a normal lens, in this case, it's an 80 millimeter lens. And to me, that's probably a throwback to the film days when most of the medium format cameras like 6x7 and 6x6 larger, and their normal lenses were 80, and they're kind of sticking with that format for its normal lens. But because we know what the normal lens should be, we know that this 80 mil is probably still a little bit towards the telephoto side compared to other, if you were to compare the normal lens, the angle of view, say on a full frame with the angle of view of this 80 on here, and just compare. So that's kind of where this whole thing comes into play. If you are looking through and I'll just give you an example. If you were looking through a 35 millimeter camera, full frame sensor camera, and you put on a 50 millimeter lens and think about the angle of view, how would that compare to the angle of view of this normal lens, 80 mil, on this camera? What would that angle of view look like? Would they be the same, or would they be a bit different? So that's why understanding how, where this angle of view, sorry, there's an example of why it's good to know how you determine what is the normal lens for a format. There might be a time when you're going to work with a 4x5 camera. Maybe you're getting into collecting old cameras and you want to start playing around with 4x5 and 8x10 cameras. Well, once you get the camera, you're going to want to start shopping for lenses. So how will you know what a normal lens is for your camera? If you bought a 4x5 camera, what's the normal lens for it? It's not 50. 50 would be an extreme wide angle on a 4x5 camera. So what is the normal lens? So that's where understanding how these formulas work is important. So I've got a project for you to do, some little bit of extra homework. If you have what they call a crop sensor camera, I'd like you to figure out what is your normal lens. What is the standard lens for your camera? So let's do the math and figure it out, and maybe I'll talk about it in next week's video, and if I get the time, maybe I'll open up a Dropbox or create a discussion folder or something where people can sort of input some of their answers. But know this, on the final exam, I will give you either the dimensions of a 4x5 or 8x10 or a 6x7 or 5x7 camera or this phase camera, and I'm going to ask you to calculate what is the normal lens for that format. Anyway, that's it for now. Boy, look at that. Week 7's relatively easy, only a couple of videos for me. And do the car assignment, and hopefully if you do the calculations for the crop sensor camera and you figure out what the normal lens is, that will help you understand why in the instruction sheet I give you 2 sets of lenses or focal lengths to use, one for full frame and one for crop sensor camera. You'll see when you do the car assignment what I'm talking about. Anyway, that's it. Hopefully that didn't confuse you too much. It's kind of a strange week. We're taking some very sort of basic fundamental concepts and just going in, diving a bit deeper, getting into a little bit more detail. That's what we're doing this week. Anyways, that's it. Good luck on the assignment, and I can't wait to read some of your answers from that project. All right.